When medieval chroniclers tried to explain the Mongols, they rarely began with numbers or formations. They began with dread. Long before armies assembled on open fields, word of the Mongols' approach traveled along the Silk Road and through frightened caravans. Merchants whispered of entire garrisons erased. Refugees spoke of cities that had resisted and vanished. By the time Mongol banners appeared on the horizon, something inside the walls had already shifted. Confidence weakened. Doubt crept into council chambers. Commanders questioned whether resistance was bravery, or suicide. This was not accidental. The Mongols understood that war did not begin at the clash of steel. It began in the mind. In 1206, when Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan on the Mongolian steppe, he commanded disciplined horsemen, not ancient capitals. Yet he grasped a truth many empires ignored: perception could move faster than cavalry. If fear arrived first, it could fracture unity before siege engines were assembled. Cities were not always destroyed through prolonged assault. Often, they were undone by calculation. The Mongols played mind games before every major attack, shaping expectations so precisely that when they finally rode into view, resistance already felt futile. Fear alone could not conquer cities. It had to be backed by a system capable of enforcing every threat. In 1206, after uniting the tribes of the Mongolian steppe, Genghis Khan began constructing that system with deliberate precision. For generations, steppe society had been fractured by clan loyalties, blood feuds, and shifting alliances. Authority rested on lineage and personal charisma. Genghis Khan dismantled that unstable structure and replaced it with disciplined organization designed for expansion. He reorganized his followers into a decimal hierarchy, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. These formations were not ceremonial titles but practical instruments of control. Warriors from rival tribes were deliberately mixed within the same units, weakening traditional loyalties and binding men directly to central command. A soldier's primary identity was no longer his clan, but his place within a structured chain of authority. Promotion depended on merit, reliability, and performance in battle rather than noble birth. Capable individuals could rise rapidly, creating a culture where competence mattered more than ancestry. Discipline was enforced through collective responsibility. If one soldier deserted or disobeyed orders, his entire unit could face punishment. This principle ensured mutual accountability and eliminated hesitation under pressure. Every man understood that failure endangered not only himself, but his comrades. Orders were expected to be executed immediately and without question. In an army built for speed and surprise, delay could mean disaster. Communication reinforced this cohesion. Mounted couriers relayed commands across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. On the battlefield, flags, horns, and drums transmitted signals that allowed separated units to coordinate complex maneuvers. What appeared to outsiders as chaotic swarms of riders were, in reality, synchronized detachments acting with calculated intent. Mobility amplified everything. Mongol warriors were expert horsemen from childhood, often traveling with multiple mounts to maintain relentless pace. They could cross deserts, rivers, and mountains faster than most armies believed possible. This fusion of organization and speed made Mongol threats credible. When a city received a demand to surrender, its leaders knew they faced not scattered raiders, but a disciplined machine capable of delivering on every promise. The mind games only worked because the consequences were real. A disciplined army could enforce threats, but information allowed the Mongols to shape events before confrontation ever began. Long before their main forces advanced, scouts were already in motion. Riders surveyed river crossings, mountain passes, and supply routes. They measured distances between settlements and studied the layout of city walls. Intelligence was not an accessory to Mongol warfare, it was its foundation. Campaigns were rarely blind invasions. They were informed operations guided by careful reconnaissance. Trade networks provided another stream of knowledge. Merchants traveling along the Silk Road carried news of political rivalries, economic strain, and unrest within distant courts. Mongol leaders understood the value of this information. Diplomatic envoys and commercial caravans observed fortifications, counted soldiers, and gauged the temperament of rulers. Even hostility offered insight. In 1218, when a Mongol caravan was seized at Otrar and its members executed on the orders of Shah Muhammad II of the Khwarezmian Empire, the incident revealed more than defiance. It exposed a ruler who underestimated the consequences of his actions and an empire confident in its walls. When Genghis Khan launched his invasion of Khwarezm in 1219, he did not march as a single overwhelming mass. Instead, Mongol forces divided into multiple columns, crossing deserts and mountain passes from different directions. Cities that expected a traditional frontal assault suddenly found themselves threatened from unexpected horizons. Communication between defenders faltered as uncertainty spread. The sense of being surrounded before battle intensified fear within city walls. Intelligence also shaped battlefield tactics. Mongol commanders studied how heavily armored cavalry favored decisive charges and how feudal coalitions often struggled with unified command. They understood that pride and momentum could be manipulated. The feigned retreat, later used to devastating effect, depended on predicting how opponents would respond under pressure. By gathering information first and striking second, the Mongols reduced the need for prolonged combat. Knowledge narrowed uncertainty for their own commanders while expanding confusion among their enemies. Plans unraveled before sieges even began. The mind games worked because they were informed by preparation. The Mongols did not rely on chaos, they engineered it. Information and discipline gave the Mongols control, but it was consistency that turned control into psychological dominance. As their campaigns expanded beyond the steppe, they developed a deliberate pattern that reshaped how cities responded to invasion. The formula was simple and brutally clear: surrender would bring survival, resistance would bring devastation. This was not uncontrolled savagery. It was calculated messaging designed to influence decisions before battle ever began. During the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire between 1219 and 1221, that pattern became unmistakable. When cities such as Bokhara resisted, Mongol forces responded with overwhelming force. Siege engines breached walls methodically, defenders were defeated decisively, and the consequences were visible enough to ensure that neighboring regions took notice. Samarkand, another great center of wealth and authority, faced similar destruction after resistance collapsed. The message was reinforced publicly and repeatedly. Yet the Mongols did not treat every city identically. When towns opened their gates quickly and pledged loyalty, destruction was often limited. Skilled artisans, engineers, and administrators were spared and integrated into the expanding empire. Local leaders were sometimes allowed to retain authority under Mongol oversight. This contrast was intentional. It demonstrated that submission could preserve life and stability, while defiance carried catastrophic risk. Survivors from devastated cities sometimes fled along trade routes, carrying first-hand accounts of what they had witnessed. These stories spread through markets and royal courts across Central Asia and beyond. Whether numbers were exaggerated mattered less than the visible pattern. Mongol threats were not empty. They had been fulfilled before, and they would be fulfilled again. This consistency reduced the need for prolonged sieges. Fear began to do much of the work. As Mongol columns approached new territories, governors weighed their options against established precedent. To resist was to gamble with annihilation. To surrender was to preserve their population and often their position. Increasingly, gates opened before catapults were assembled. The mind game lay in predictability. By enforcing their threats without hesitation and rewarding submission with restraint, the Mongols ensured that their reputation carried weight. Cities were not always destroyed through drawn-out fighting. Many were undone by rational calculation shaped by credible fear. If consistency made Mongol threats believable, battlefield deception made them devastating. Even when open combat could not be avoided, Mongol commanders sought to manipulate expectation before delivering a decisive blow. Their most infamous tactic, the feigned retreat, transformed an enemy's confidence into vulnerability. It began with what appeared to be ordinary engagement. Mongol cavalry advanced in loose formation, releasing volleys of arrows to disrupt and provoke. Then, at a carefully chosen moment, they turned and withdrew. To opponents trained in traditions of decisive charges and visible dominance, retreat signaled weakness. Victory seemed within reach. The instinct to pursue felt natural. But the withdrawal was rarely genuine. Mongol riders maintained disciplined spacing even while retreating at speed. They fired backward from their saddles with remarkable accuracy, harassing pursuers and stretching formations thinner with every passing moment. As heavily armored cavalry surged forward, infantry struggled to keep pace. Communication faltered in dust and noise. Units outran their commanders. What had been a unified line fractured into scattered groups. The Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223 demonstrated how precisely this tactic could dismantle an army. Mongol generals Subutai and Jebe faced a coalition of Rus princes and their Kuman allies. After initial clashes, the Mongols withdrew deliberately, drawing the coalition into pursuit that lasted several days. Convinced they were chasing a broken enemy, the Rus forces advanced across unfamiliar terrain, fatigue mounting and coordination weakening. When the Mongols finally turned to fight decisively, they did so on ground they had selected carefully. Hidden reserves struck from the flanks, completing an encirclement that trapped the exhausted coalition. Leaders were targeted first, accelerating panic. The alliance collapsed into disorganized resistance and was destroyed. Such maneuvers demanded extraordinary discipline. A retreat risks becoming genuine if morale falters, yet Mongol units trusted their structure and timing. Their enemies, driven by pride and the desire for swift triumph, often contributed to their own defeat. The battlefield became psychological terrain. By exploiting the assumption that retreat meant weakness, the Mongols turned expectation into a weapon. Each victory reinforced their reputation, ensuring that future opponents would hesitate, uncertain whether what they saw was real or another calculated illusion. By 1241, the Mongol advance had reached the frontiers of Europe, and the psychological strategies refined in Central Asia were about to confront a new audience. For years, fragmented reports of devastation had filtered westward, principalities overrun, rulers fleeing, armies destroyed. Yet distance bred disbelief. Many European leaders assumed the threat exaggerated or confined to lands beyond their concern. That illusion ended in April. On April 9, 1241, near Legnica in Poland, a coalition of European forces assembled to confront the Mongol army led by Bata Khan and the experienced general Subutai. Silesian knights and contingents of the Teutonic Order stood prepared, confident in heavy armor and the shock tactics that had defined their battlefield tradition. The engagement unfolded in a familiar pattern. Mongol horse archers exchanged arrows before appearing to withdraw. The response was immediate. Knights charged in pursuit, formations stretching as speed overtook coordination. Dust and smoke obscured visibility, blurring signals and disrupting command. At a chosen moment, Mongol units pivoted and counterattacked. Arrows struck commanders first, severing the chain of control. Units that had advanced too far found themselves isolated. What began as a confident advance dissolved into fragmented resistance. 2 days later, on April 11, a larger confrontation took place at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary. King Bela IV positioned his forces near the Sejo River, believing the natural barrier and fortified camp would restrict Mongol maneuver. The Mongols launched a frontal assault at the main bridge, fixing Hungarian attention. Under cover of darkness, another force constructed a crossing downstream. When battle resumed, Hungarian troops faced attacks from multiple directions. Feigned withdrawals lured segments into exposed ground while encirclement tightened around the camp. Heavy armor, once an advantage, became a burden in mud and chaos. The psychological consequences rippled across Europe. Survivors carried stories of sudden reversals and disciplined maneuvering to courts already uneasy. Fortifications no longer seemed sufficient. Familiar strategies felt unreliable. Even where resistance remained fierce, the message was clear: the Mongols did not simply defeat armies. They dismantled certainty. Their mind games traveled ahead of them, weakening confidence before the next clash of steel. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols had extended their reach deep into the Middle East, and their reputation had become a force as powerful as their cavalry. Yet the campaign that culminated in 1258 would demonstrate how psychological warfare could be amplified through symbolism. Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, advanced toward Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. For centuries, Baghdad had stood as a political and intellectual center of the Islamic world, a city whose prestige seemed inseparable from its survival. Many believed that its history and spiritual authority offered protection. The Mongols saw only a strategic objective. Hulagu's approach followed the established pattern. Mongol forces encircled the city, severing supply routes and preventing escape. Siege engines, refined through earlier campaigns in China and Central Asia, were assembled with calculated efficiency. Artillery battered the walls while cavalry sealed the perimeter. The assault was disciplined and methodical rather than chaotic. Within weeks, the defenses failed. The fall of Baghdad carried consequences far beyond military defeat. Contemporary chroniclers described immense destruction and loss of life, though accounts vary in scale. What is certain is the psychological shock. The Abbasid Caliph, long regarded as a symbol of enduring authority, proved unable to defend his capital. Institutions associated with centuries of scholarship were devastated, reinforcing the perception that an established order had collapsed. Whether every detail was precise mattered less than how the event was understood across the region. The message was unmistakable. If Baghdad could fall, no city could rely solely on prestige, faith, or history for protection. The established pattern of submission or destruction was reinforced at the highest symbolic level. Rulers across neighboring territories recalculated their options. Resistance now seemed not only dangerous, but futile. In many regions, opposition weakened before Mongol forces even arrived. The example of Baghdad functioned as a warning more powerful than any diplomatic demand. The mind games reached their peak here, not simply through violence, but through the destruction of a symbol once thought untouchable. Fear no longer traveled as rumor. It carried the weight of a fallen capital. In the end, the Mongols proved that the battlefield was only one part of war. Their greatest victories often began before swords were drawn. Discipline made their threats enforceable. Intelligence made their movements unpredictable. Consistency made their promises credible. Together, these elements allowed them to shape how enemies thought long before confrontation began. Cities surrendered not only because walls were vulnerable, but because precedent had made resistance seem irrational. Armies hesitated because previous coalitions had collapsed under similar illusions. Yet psychological dominance required momentum. After the deaths of powerful khans and the fragmentation of the empire into separate khanates, the aura of inevitability began to weaken. Expansion slowed. Rivals adapted to Mongol tactics and learned to resist manipulation. Fear, once their most efficient weapon, demanded constant reinforcement. What endured was the transformation they had imposed on warfare itself. The Mongols demonstrated that victory could be engineered in advance by controlling perception. They showed that uncertainty, doubt, and expectation could be as destructive as fire and steel. Long after their empire divided, the lesson remained: the sharpest weapon is often the one the enemy never sees.